Deep within the ruins of early agricultural settlements across the Levant, dating back to 11,000 BCE, a silent battleground lies hidden in the fossilized remnants of the very first einkorn and emmer wheat harvests. For generations, the heart of the human home has been built around the harvest, a seemingly safe haven where golden grain was transformed into the daily sustenance of millions. But beneath the crust of that ancient everyday loaf lies a chilling biological reality that most of us today consume entirely blind. The unfermented grains sitting peacefully in modern pantries harbor a microscopic defense mechanism, a hidden danger that turns our most fundamental source of survival into a quiet catalyst for chronic illness and systemic inflammation. This invisible threat locked inside our daily bread is not a modern mutation, but an evolutionary weapon forged in the dawn of agriculture. Because plants lack teeth and claws to fight off predators, they protect their embryonic offspring with sophisticated chemical warfare, deploying potent anti-nutrients to ensure their seeds survive the brutal passage through the digestive tracts of hungry animals. It forces a profound and unsettling question about the foundations of human history. We look at the towering monuments of antiquity like the massive 2.5-ton limestone blocks of the Egyptian pyramids at Giza, dragged across burning sands by thousands of laborers who fueled their immense physical strength with a daily, monotonous ration of emmer wheat grain and thick beer. A haunting paradox emerges when we realize those ancient builders thrived on the exact same harvests that now trigger massive, crippling gut health epidemics and autoimmune disorders across the modern world. Somewhere in the shadows of time, a vital, life-saving step in preparing our food was quietly erased from human memory, leaving us entirely vulnerable to the very crops that built human civilization. The devastating cost of this forgotten knowledge is now measured in the millions of modern stomachs, quietly at war with their own meals. Gastrointestinal distress, chronic fatigue, and a multi-billion-dollar antacid industry are the direct consequences of a population continuously forcing unfermented, chemically fortified dough through digestive systems that cannot process the raw botanical defense mechanisms. The source of this widespread suffering is a chemical vault designed by nature to protect the unborn plant. Seeds rely on a potent defense system known as phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that acts as an impenetrable biological lock. This dense, 6-carbon ring loaded with phosphorus operates as a botanical fortress, guarding the seed until the exact moment conditions are perfect for germination. When a human consumes raw or quickly baked grain, this phytic acid aggressively binds to essential minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium inside the digestive tract through a process called chelation. It effectively steals the nutrition right out of the body, passing through the system while leaving the consumer quietly starved of the very elements they desperately need to survive and thrive. Deep within the dark, twisting corridors of the human gut, this chemical lockdown turns a supposedly nourishing meal into an agent of silent depletion. Stomach acids are completely powerless to break these rigid phytic bonds, allowing the grain to act like a molecular sponge that absorbs vital nutrients and leaves the body's immune system progressively weakened with every single bite. Early agricultural societies faced a terrifying turning point when the illusion of their newfound food security began to shatter. They had traded the perilous life of hunting for the predictable yield of farming, only to watch their children grow weak, their skeletons bearing the telltale porous marks of severe anemia, despite storehouses overflowing with freshly harvested wheat and barley. The crushing realization set in that the very crops they toiled over to escape starvation were actively malnourishing them from the inside out. It was a grim race against time to unlock the nutritional vault of the seed before entire Neolithic settlements succumbed to the slow, agonizing decay of mineral deficiency, stunted growth, and opportunistic infection. To survive this agricultural trap, humanity had to find a way to break the molecular chains of phytic acid without destroying the grain itself. Fire alone was completely useless, as boiling and roasting left the brutal anti-nutrients perfectly intact. They needed a biological key that could mimic the natural germination of the seed in the damp earth. That ancient dread has silently crept back into the brightly lit kitchens of the 21st century. When you pull a soft, mass-produced loaf of bread from a plastic wrapper, you are holding the exact same heavily defended, locked seeds that brought early farmers to the brink of nutritional collapse, now processed in factories that complete the baking cycle in mere minutes. The modern industrial baking process, prioritizing speed and profit over human survival, entirely skips the crucial time-consuming step required to neutralize the grain's natural armor. We are unknowingly feeding our families a fundamentally incomplete food, swallowing the same microscopic locks that our ancestors fought so desperately to break, engineered only to rise quickly and sit endlessly on supermarket shelves. The salvation of early humanity did not come from a brilliant flash of scientific insight, but from a desperate, eerie accident in the shadows. Imagine a damp, forgotten clay bowl of crushed emmer wheat and river water left entirely abandoned in the warm, dark corner of a primitive dwelling in the Fertile Crescent for days on end. Driven by the gnawing ache of hunger, someone eventually returned to that porous terracotta bowl, finding the mixture strange, sour-smelling, and bubbling with a mysterious, almost breathing life of its own. In a moment of pure survival instinct, rather than throwing the rotting dough away, they cooked it over hot stones, unknowingly unleashing a profound biological miracle. That single, desperate act of consuming what appeared to be spoiled grain changed the trajectory of human health forever. The resulting bread was not dense and heavy, but remarkably light, easily digestible, and intensely nourishing. The invisible microbial colonies had performed external digestion, unlocking the crucial iron and zinc that the human body required to build a flourishing civilization. What those early humans witnessed was not magic, but the visible aftermath of a brutal microscopic war known as fermentation. Millions of invisible wild bacteria and wild yeasts had invaded the wet dough, launching a covert operation to dismantle the phytic acid from the inside out by producing an enzyme called phytase, the exact biochemical key needed to shatter the seed's ancient defense mechanism. This was not magic, but a covert, microscopic war playing out in the dark. Millions of invisible bacteria, primarily from the Lactobacillus family, alongside wild Saccharomyces yeasts, invaded the raw dough, launching a relentless assault against the grain's natural defenses. They systematically dismantled the chemical locks, specifically phytic acid, that hoarded the seed's nutrients, neutralizing the very toxins designed to starve any creature that dared to consume it. This silent, invisible siege transformed a toxic defense mechanism into a profound source of life. The resulting chemical surrender meant that human bodies could suddenly absorb vital minerals like zinc, iron, and magnesium that would have otherwise passed through their digestive tracts completely untouched. This microscopic breakdown quietly saved early agrarian tribes from rampant malnutrition, severe anemia, and catastrophic bone density loss. Yet a haunting mystery remains at the very center of this ancient practice. How did this incredibly specific, life-saving knowledge spread across the world thousands of years before the microbiologist Louis Pasteur ever identified a single yeast cell? These early societies achieved profound biological engineering without a single microscope, modern laboratory, or formal understanding of the microbial universe. They were manipulating across isolated continents and vast oceans. Completely disconnected cultures all arrived at the exact same chilling realization. From the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia to the sprawling valleys of the Yellow River, they somehow understood that leaving their precious, hard-earned food out in the warm air to bubble, sour, and seemingly rot was not a path to disease, but the only true key to their long-term survival. This universal instinct to harness controlled decay pushed humanity out of the shadows of starvation and into the dawn of civilization during the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 BC. The most striking evidence of this massive leap forward does not exist in written texts, but instead lies buried deep within the dark, silent sands of antiquity, waiting thousands of years to be uncovered. Deep within the stifling, sealed tombs of ancient Egypt, archaeologists made a stunning discovery hidden alongside the mummified remains of pharaohs dating back to 2000 BC. They unearthed the desiccated, fossilized remnants of the world's very first documented sourdough. These incredibly preserved artifacts provided the first physical proof that early empires relied heavily on complex microbial ecosystems to sustain their exploding population. These hardened loaves of emmer wheat and barley were not mere ceremonial offerings for the afterlife, but the vital, fermented fuel that built a sprawling civilization. The Egyptians had unknowingly mastered the complex art of biological alchemy, cultivating vast, bubbling vats of wild yeast and bacteria that successfully fed millions of citizens living along the harsh, unforgiving banks of the Nile River. The discovery of these ancient sour loaves, alongside massive industrial bakeries, unearthed at the Giza workers' village by modern archaeologists, forced historians to completely rewrite their understanding of how such massive workforces were sustained. It revealed a highly organized, state-run baking operation that relied entirely on the slow, deliberate, temperature-controlled fermentation of raw, unrefined wheat to keep an entire nation alive. To construct the towering monuments of Giza, tens of thousands of laborers endured crushing, bone-breaking work under a merciless sun, hauling limestone blocks that weighed over 2.5 tons. The physical toll on their bodies was unimaginable, requiring a constant massive influx of more than 4,000 easily absorbed calories and critical minerals every single day, just to survive another brutal shift in the dusty quarries. The shocking truth is that their incredible endurance did not come from lavish diets of rich meats or endless, decadent feasts. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was built on the weary backs of men whose primary source of strength was their daily, heavily rationed supply of sour, deeply fermented bread and thick, microbially active beer distributed in standardized clay molds. Compare that sacred living sustenance to the sterile, plastic-wrapped aisles of our modern grocery stores. Today, the bread we absent-mindedly throw into our shopping carts is a lifeless, chemical-laden shadow of its ancient ancestor, a product of the hyper-industrialized Corleywood baking process introduced in the 1960s to maximize corporate profits at the direct expense of human nutrition. We have traded a slow, life-saving biological process that took days to complete for the dangerous convenience of rapid, factory-produced dough that goes from flour to oven in mere hours. The modern loaf is pumped full of artificial preservatives like calcium propionate and fast-acting commercial yeasts, completely bypassing the crucial fermentation stage that once protected our ancestors from the grain's hidden botanical toxins. This catastrophic shift away from living, fermented bread means we are now directly consuming the very chemical locks that the ancients fought so hard to break. To truly understand what we have lost in our modern diet, we must look at the exact, microscopic science of what those early bakers were actually doing in the dark, sweltering shadows of the Great Pyramids. In the sweltering heat of their ancient bakeries, the Egyptians orchestrated a brilliant biological hack using nothing more than coarse stone-ground flour, river water, and thyme. They created a dark symbiotic alliance between wild airborne yeasts and naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria, allowing them to thrive and multiply exponentially within the warm dough stored in massive porous clay fermentation vessels. As this microscopic ecosystem fed on the complex sugars in the wheat, it produced a powerful organic acid that systematically tore through the grain's tough outer defenses, dropping the pH level below 4.0. This slow, acidic bath predigested the harsh gluten proteins and completely neutralized the phytic acid by activating the phytase enzyme, unlocking a treasure trove of vital nutrients before the bread ever entered a human stomach. This deliberate acidic breakdown transformed an otherwise indigestible seed into an absolute powerhouse of sustained human energy, lowering the glycemic index and preventing dangerous blood sugar spikes in the labor force. It was a fragile, invisible biological process that held the entire fate of a sprawling, monument-building civilization in its delicate, microscopic balance. The historical implications of this ancient biological mastery are profoundly unsettling. Had the Egyptian overseers been impatient, had they simply ground their raw wheat and baked it quickly without this essential slow fermentation process, their mighty empire would have likely fractured and collapsed under its own weight as severe nutritional deficiencies like pellagra and rickets swept through the working population, without the microscopic lactic acid bacteria breaking down those rigid chemical locks. Widespread crippling malnutrition would have rapidly ravaged the massive labor force. The pharaoh's grand architectural visions would have crumbled into the desert sand, halted not by invading foreign armies, but by the devastating, silent starvation hidden entirely within the unfermented core of their own daily bread. Had the ancient Egyptians not stumbled upon this slow biological alchemy around 3000 BCE, the foundation of their entire civilization would have crumbled under the weight of severe malnutrition. Without the enhanced nutrient profile provided by fermentation, The millions of laborers and artisans responsible for constructing monumental architecture would have succumbed to stunted growth, rampant bone disease, and total immune failure. This physical survival depended entirely on a substance they treated with a daily reverence bordering on the supernatural. In the shadowed corners of ancient stone kitchens along the Nile River, bubbling, porous clay jars held the very pulse of the community. These were the original sourdough starters, complex and wild colonies of lactobacillus bacteria and Saccharomyces yeast, cultivated directly from the arid desert air and the raw emmer wheat itself. These microbial colonies were not just simple baking ingredients, but highly guarded living heirlooms. Families fed their specific cultures daily, carefully stirring exact ratios of river water and ground flour to maintain the biological balance, passing these vital breathing organisms down through decades and even centuries like sacred family members. To neglect the feeding schedule and let the starter die was to literally invite starvation and disease into the home. This unbroken, multi-generational chain of living microbes was the absolute only thing standing between thriving metropolitan centers like Memphis or Thebes, which housed tens of thousands of citizens, and a slow, agonizing societal decline. The acidic environment created by the bacteria acted as a microscopic defense grid, neutralizing deadly foodborne pathogens before they could decimate the densely packed urban population. Yet, as profound as this early Egyptian biological mastery was, an even darker medical mystery was unfolding thousands of miles across the ocean. Around 1500 BCE, in the lush, untamed landscapes of ancient Mesoamerica, early civilizations like the Olmec and Maya were building vast empires on a newly domesticated golden grain. This was maize or corn, a crop possessing such immense agricultural power that it was deeply woven into their very creation myths, with legends stating the first humans were physically forged from maize dough. But beneath its bright, sun-yellow kernels hid a terrifying, entirely invisible danger. This was not a threat stemming from a lack of nutrients, but a cruel biological lock that turned a seemingly life-giving harvest into a silent, slow-acting killer. Because these ancient societies relied on maize for up to 80% of their daily caloric intake, the very food that sustained their physical labor harbored a devastating chemical secret that could quite literally drive a person to sheer, violent madness. Unlocking the hidden nutritional vault inside this golden grain would require a leap of human ingenuity so strange and so inherently dangerous that it completely defies modern culinary logic. The process they eventually developed involved highly corrosive materials that could easily burn human skin or destroy the digestive tract if handled improperly, making the initial discovery a high-stakes gamble with human life. The deadly biological trap of raw corn lay deep within its microscopic chemical structure. The grain was actually packed with a vital, life-sustaining nutrient called niacin, also known as vitamin B3, which is absolutely essential for human cellular metabolism and DNA repair. But nature had bound this crucial vitamin up incredibly tight into a complex molecule called niacin, locking the nutrient away behind an impenetrable chemical wall that human stomach acid simply cannot break down. If a person simply picked the raw corn, ground the kernels into a coarse meal, and baked it over an open fire, that life-saving niacin remained completely inaccessible to the human body. The bound vitamin would pass right through the digestive system, untouched, unabsorbed, and entirely useless. The indigenous people would be eating massive calorie-dense meals, their stomachs physically heavy with pounds of grain, while their internal organs and neurological systems quietly starved to death from the inside out. This invisible, cellular-level starvation set the stage for what would become one of the most horrific, slow-moving medical tragedies in human history. When European colonizers later exported corn across the globe without understanding the native preparation methods, they inadvertently triggered massive, deadly epidemics of this exact nutritional deficiency, killing hundreds of thousands of people who relied on the unprocessed grain. Without that locked-away vitamin to fuel basic cellular function, the human body begins a gruesome, unstoppable process of self-destruction medically known as pellagra. The disease starts as a quiet whisper over several weeks, presenting as a strange muscular weakness, severe digestive distress, and a painful burning sensitivity to the sun, but it rapidly escalates into a waking, inescapable nightmare as the body's tissues literally begin to break down and fail. The victim's skin darkens drastically and begins to peel away in thick, rotting scales, leaving raw, weeping wounds exposed across the face, hands, and a distinct collar-like rash around the neck known as Casal's necklace. Severe chronic sickness completely paralyzes the stomach and intestines, and then the most terrifying neurological symptom takes hold. The brain's neural pathways begin to fracture, plunging the victim into severe hallucinations, violent paranoia, and a total descent into aggressive psychosis before death finally claims them. To survive this agonizing widespread fate, the ancient people of the Americas had to find a reliable way to forcefully break the microscopic chemical chains hiding inside their daily bread. Operating thousands of years before the invention of modern laboratory chemistry or microscopes, they had to rely entirely on generations of ruthless trial and error to unlock the nutritional vault of maize, knowing the survival of their rapidly expanding population depended absolutely on the outcome. Their ultimate solution was a shocking stroke of brilliant, desperate alchemy that modern food scientists now call nixtamalization. They did not just boil the raw corn in fresh water. Instead, they took the highly alkaline, cold gray ashes left over from their hardwood cooking fires, or crushed mineral limestone gathered directly from the earth, and intentionally mixed these harsh, caustic materials right into their boiling cooking pots. They were intentionally creating a harsh, caustic, alkaline bath with a pH level reaching 11 or higher. By soaking the rock-hard kernels in this aggressive, ash-filled water for hours or even overnight, they triggered a violent chemical reaction that dissolved the grain's tough outer hull, known as the pericarp. It was a highly dangerous, corrosive process that would easily strip the skin off a human hand, making it seem much more like brewing a deadly poison than preparing a daily meal to any untrained observer. Yet this very specific, counterintuitive act of boiling their primary food source in toxic wood ash was the exact molecular key needed to shatter the complex chemical lock of niacin. The alkaline solution broke down the hemicellulose in the grain, instantly releasing the life-saving niacin for human absorption, while simultaneously transforming the rigid kernels into a soft, highly nutritious, and easily digestible dough known as masa. Imagine the sheer, terrifying desperation and the staggering observational genius it took to discover this exact chemical sequence. How many early generations suffered in the horrific grip of aggressive madness and rotting skin before someone realized that the seemingly toxic gray ash scooped from their fire pit was actually the definitive cure? Whether discovered through an accidental spill of ash into a boiling pot or centuries of meticulous testing, it remains a chilling testament to the human will to survive against statistically impossible odds. This highly engineered process was not just a lucky culinary accident, but a profound life-or-death observation of the natural chemical world. By intentionally marrying the Earth's harsh, corrosive minerals with their daily agricultural harvest, these ancient Mesoamerican minds saved their entire civilization from a horrific, agonizing end. This breakthrough directly fueled the rise of massive empires holding millions of citizens, proving unequivocally that our ancestors possessed a rigorous empirical scientific wisdom far deeper and far more sophisticated than modern history often admits. The process of nixtamalization was a brilliant act of chemistry disguised as a simple cooking chore. When ancient Mesoamerican people mixed crushed limestone or wood ash into water, they created a harsh, highly alkaline bath with a pH level near 11. This caustic solution was the perfect chemical key for their raw harvest. Dropping the hard, raw kernels into this cloudy liquid triggered a violent microscopic reaction. The alkaline water literally burned away the tough, indigestible hemicellulose outer skin of the corn. More importantly, the chemical bath unlocked trapped niacin, or vitamin B3, fundamentally changing the grain's molecular structure into something the human body could actually use to survive. This single, deliberate step of soaking the harvest in ash water meant the difference between a thriving civilization and widespread starvation. Without this chemical transformation, the massive populations of the Aztec and Maya empires simply could not have sustained their sprawling cities on a diet so heavily dependent on field maize. But when European colonizers arrived on these shores in the late 15th century, they saw only the golden harvest and completely missed the hidden science. They eagerly took the strange new crop back across the Atlantic Ocean to feed a hungry world, viewing the native practice of soaking the kernels in dirty ash water as nothing more than a primitive, pointless ritual. Driven by a profound arrogance, these explorers stripped away the ancient wisdom, planting and eating the raw corn exactly as it grew. 16th century European farmers believed they had discovered a high-yield miracle food that would easily sustain their growing empires and peasant populations without any complicated, time-consuming chemical preparation required by the indigenous cultures. By discarding the crucial step of nixtamalization, these foreign explorers unwittingly unleashed a biological nightmare upon their own people. The unsoaked grain provided vast amounts of empty calories, but it actively deprived the human body of vital nutrients, setting a devastating physiological trap that would take generations to fully understand. As this raw, unprepared corn spread rapidly across Europe and later into the American South, a dark, creeping shadow followed closely behind it. Entire communities began to fall ill with a terrifying, unknown affliction that seemed to target the poorest agricultural families and mill workers who relied almost exclusively on the cheap grain to survive. It was a grim, silent killer that slowly robbed people of their minds and bodies, manifesting first as a severe blistering rash before attacking the nervous system. The sheer dread of this invisible plague shattered families, leaving behind a trail of confusion and agonizing grief as healthy individuals withered away into dementia before their loved ones' eyes. The desolate rural farmlands and crowded industrial slums quickly became breeding grounds for a mystery that no medical authority knew how to fight. By the early 1900s, southern orphanages, remote cotton mill villages, and crowded state penitentiaries across the United States were overrun with victims suffering from the exact same horrifying symptoms. For decades, the brightest medical minds of the modern world were completely baffled by the spreading epidemic they eventually called pellagra. Convinced that the disease was caused by a dirty, infectious germ or spoiled crops, top government doctors launched massive investigations, searching desperately for a microscopic villain in the local water supplies or the soil. They ran countless laboratory tests and enforced strict community quarantines, entirely blind to the truth sitting right on the dinner plates of the afflicted. Their absolute certainty in modern infectious disease theories prevented them from realizing that the sickness was not an infection at all, but a severe nutritional starvation caused directly by the locked vitamins in the raw corn. This catastrophic failure of modern medicine allowed the disease to ravage vulnerable populations for over 2 centuries. In the United States alone, between the years 1906 and 1940, pellagra struck an estimated 3 million people, leaving a staggering official death toll of 100,000 victims, while health authorities chased imaginary bacteria. The human cost of this scientific oversight was almost unbearable to measure. Hundreds of thousands of victims were locked away in state insane asylums as the disease ravaged their central nervous systems, their skin peeling and blistering in agonizing pain as their minds slowly fractured into severe, irreversible dementia behind institutional walls. They died alone in cold, dark, institutional cells, casually labeled as lunatics or victims of poor hygiene and genetic inferiority. The most profound tragedy is that their immense suffering could have been entirely prevented by a handful of simple wood ash, a piece of ancient indigenous wisdom discarded by those who thought they knew better. The medical establishment eventually uncovered the missing nutrient when biochemists isolated niacin in 1937, but it was far too late for the generations already lost to the asylum walls. The mass fortification of commercial flour finally halted the epidemic, closing a dark chapter written entirely by the arrogance of ignoring ancestral knowledge. When we step back from the specific tragedy of the pellagra epidemic, a much larger, awe-inspiring historical mystery comes into sharp focus. This was never just an isolated incident of one Mesoamerican culture figuring out how to safely eat one specific plant to avoid a single, localized nutritional deficiency in their daily diet. From the bubbling sourdough pots of ancient Egypt to the ash-soaked cornfields of Mexico, our ancestors were all locked in the exact same unseen battle for survival. They were fighting a hidden war against the chemical defenses of the earth, using nothing but their instincts and the natural elements around them to unlock the life-saving power of their food. These scattered human civilizations, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years of history, had independently discovered the exact same biological loophole. Through fermentation, soaking, and alkaline baths, early humans effectively hacked the chemical structure of the natural world, engineering a global survival strategy that laid the very foundation for modern human society. Thousands of miles from the ash-soaked cornfields of the Americas, another desperate struggle for survival was unfolding across the rugged, high-altitude plateaus of Ethiopia. Here in the Horn of Africa, early agriculturalists relied on teff, a grass seed measuring less than 1 millimeter in diameter. This grain was so incredibly tiny that 150 seeds weighed as much as a single kernel of wheat. Yet it held the heavy burden of keeping an entire civilization alive. These highland farmers did not simply grind this microscopic seed and bake it into brittle, lifeless dust. Instead, they mixed the raw flour with water and a portion of fermented batter from a previous batch, initiating a slow, deliberate fermentation process spanning up to 72 hours. This careful incubation allowed an invisible army of wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria to completely transform the harsh, unyielding grain into the spongy, sour flatbread known as injera. This quiet, daily ritual of souring teff effectively dismantled the grain's natural chemical defenses, specifically targeting and neutralizing the high levels of phytic acid that naturally bind to essential minerals. By breaking down these anti-nutrients, the fermentation process unlocked massive quantities of bioavailable iron, calcium, and complex amino acids that would have otherwise passed through the human body entirely unabsorbed. When comparing the teff fermentation of East Africa to the nixtamalization of Mesoamerica and the sourdough cultures of the Fertile Crescent, a shocking, undeniable pattern begins to emerge from the shadows of our deep history. Archaeological records from nearly every continent reveal that almost every successful ancient civilization was built upon a deliberate, highly engineered foundation of controlled rock. Human dominance on Earth was not secured merely by the mechanical invention of the wheel, the strategic domestication of livestock, or the violent forging of iron blades. It was ultimately made possible because our ancestors learned to weaponize decay itself, systematically domesticating microscopic forces of death and decomposition to unlock the hidden life-sustaining calories locked within their otherwise indigestible grain harvests. This invisible war was not just happening inside sealed clay pots, wooden fermentation vats, or stone hearths, but deep within the dark, highly complex ecosystem of the human gut microbiome. Over thousands of generations, the human digestive tract evolved as a frontline trench, adapting its biological architecture to rely entirely on a steady daily influx of these fermented living foods to function properly. Even though they completely lacked high-powered microscopes, genetic sequencing, and modern medical science, our agrarian ancestors instinctively understood a profound biological truth through thousands of years of trial and error. They knew with a primal certainty based on empirical observation that they had to feed the unseen microscopic forces within their own bodies before those bodies could successfully draw physical strength from the earth. Without this daily reinforcement of fermented sustenance, the fragile internal environment of the human digestive system would rapidly collapse under the strain of raw, unprocessed grains. This microbial depletion would immediately leave the body defenseless against severe malnutrition, chronic joint inflammation, and devastating deficiency diseases like pellagra and anemia, effectively causing starvation even on a full stomach. What we are looking at in these ancient foodways is a vital symbiotic alliance forged over thousands of years between human beings and billions of single-celled microbes. Consuming a coarse piece of fermented rye sourdough in medieval Europe or a warm bowl of nixtamalized corn porridge in the Andes did far more than simply fill an empty, aching stomach. Every single bite constantly repopulated the lower digestive tract with fierce, beneficial strains of lactobacillus and other vital probiotics. This living food directly reinforced the intestinal lining, dramatically improving baseline immune function and turning the human stomach into a highly efficient biological engine, capable of extracting life-saving minerals like zinc and magnesium from otherwise impenetrable plant matter. This ancient biological pact was a quiet, uncelebrated miracle of human survival, establishing a sacred trust between humanity and the microscopic world. It was this exact microbial partnership that kept our ancestors breathing, working, and reproducing through brutal sub-zero winters, prolonged seasonal droughts, and devastating localized famines when every single available calorie meant the difference between life and death. Yet, as we look around at the chronic health crises of today, we must ask how modern industrialized society strayed so catastrophically far from this vital, life-saving truth. Over the last century and a half, we have inherited a clinical, highly processed world that views the entire microscopic realm with deep, uncompromising suspicion and escalating fear. We now perceive almost all bacteria as hostile, disease-carrying enemies to be ruthlessly sanitized, chemically bleached, and systematically destroyed at every possible turn. In our relentless modern pursuit of absolute domestic cleanliness and food safety, we have completely blinded ourselves to the crucial microscopic allies that successfully kept our species alive for over 10,000 years. It is a chilling realization that our cultural obsession with maintaining a perfectly sterile existence has quietly severed the ancient invisible tether that connected us to the very source of human vitality. By eradicating the living cultures from our daily diets, we have inadvertently triggered a massive rise in modern digestive disorders and widespread autoimmune dysfunction. The devastating pivot occurred in the shadows of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven entirely by the relentless, profit-driven gears of the Industrial Revolution. The invention of the high-speed steel roller mill in the 1870s, combined with the laboratory isolation of rapid commercial yeast strains, fundamentally dismantled thousands of years of accumulated dietary wisdom in just a few short decades. Almost overnight, traditional bread making was violently transformed from a slow, life-giving fermentation process into a rapid, highly mechanized assembly line. The living, breathing sourdough that once required up to 48 hours of careful tending and atmospheric exposure was abruptly replaced by a sterile, fast-rising commercial product designed to move from raw flour to a plastic wrapper in under 3 hours. This sudden industrialized acceleration completely bypassed the essential biological breakdown of plant toxins and complex gluten proteins. By skipping the vital souring phase entirely, factories locked away the grain's essential nutrients behind impenetrable chemical walls, flooding modern human bodies with a heavy, indigestible burden of raw starches and active anti-nutrients that our ancestors purposefully engineered out of their diet. This massive industrial shift is not just a distant, abstract historical event. It echoes directly inside your own kitchen, hiding in plain sight within the brightly lit, sterile bread aisles of the local supermarket. The unsettling truth is that the modern, preservative-laden loaf sitting in a pantry right now was chemically engineered purely for a 3-week shelf life and maximum corporate profit, completely stripped of the ancient, microscopic life required to truly sustain human health. Walk down any brightly lit aisle of a modern grocery store, and you are surrounded by a quiet, devastating betrayal. The rows of perfectly uniform, soft and unnaturally white bread sitting on those shelves were never designed to nourish the human body. They were engineered in corporate laboratories with a single cold purpose in mind, prioritizing indefinite shelf life and maximum profit over our fundamental survival. We bring these hollow loaves into our homes, feeding them to our families, completely unaware that the very foundation of human sustenance has been quietly replaced by an industrial imitation. This silent substitution in our pantries set the stage for a biological disaster we are only just beginning to understand. The tragedy began inside the deafening, dust-choked walls of modern flour mills where massive steel rollers replaced the slow, grinding stones of our ancestors. These colossal machines were designed to violently tear the wheat kernel apart, aggressively stripping away the nutrient-dense bran and the life-giving germ. What was once a complete living seed was systematically dismantled, leaving behind nothing but a fine, lifeless white powder. This aggressive processing creates a barren landscape of empty, locked starch that the human digestive tract was never meant to encounter in isolation. The essential vitamins, the crucial minerals, and the very enzymes required to break the grain down are swept away as waste fed to livestock, while humans are left with the hollow remnants. It is a chilling picture of modern efficiency, transforming a vital food source into a barren metabolic burden. By tearing the grain apart, the industrial machine essentially broke the ancient biological lock, but threw away the key. The true horror of this industrialization was not just what was removed, but what was unwittingly invited back into our daily meals. By abandoning the slow, deliberate process of traditional sourdough fermentation, commercial bakeries eliminated the essential microscopic battle that neutralizes the grain's natural defenses. The fast-acting commercial yeast used today simply inflates the dough with gas, entirely bypassing the vital breakdown of the seed's protective armor. As a direct result, phytic acid, the ancient invisible anti-nutrient that our ancestors worked so hard to destroy, flooded back into our diets. Every slice of modern unfermented bread carries this chemical trap into our stomachs, where it aggressively binds to essential minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium. We are consuming food that actively robs our bodies of the very nutrients it pretends to provide, a microscopic theft happening with every single bite. This invisible robbery, repeated meal after meal, laid the hidden groundwork for a modern health crisis. There is a direct, undeniable cause and effect between this covert shift in our food system and the sudden explosive rise of modern digestive diseases. For thousands of years, the slow fermentation of grains pre-digested the complex proteins, including gluten, breaking them down into manageable pieces before they ever reached human lips. When we abruptly removed that crucial ancient step, we forced our own digestive tracts to take on a violent chemical burden they were completely unprepared to handle. The resulting damage is profound and widespread, manifesting as the modern epidemic of gluten intolerance, chronic inflammation, and severe gut dysfunction. Our immune systems, encountering these large, unbroken, and unfermented proteins, perceive them not as food, but as dangerous foreign invaders. We are essentially experiencing a mass allergic reaction to our own daily bread, a biological rebellion triggered by a fatal disruption of an ancient partnership. The human stomach has become a battleground, struggling to process a modern invention that masquerades as an ancient staple. This internal war leaves millions of people trapped in a cycle of feeling constantly sick, bloated, and inexplicably fatigued, desperately searching for answers in medicine cabinets. They wake up exhausted. They eat to find energy, and yet they only feel worse, their bodies crying out for true nourishment while trapped under the weight of industrial convenience. It is a deeply unsettling reality to walk through life feeling broken by the very food that is supposed to sustain you. The darkest tragedy of this modern condition is that these individuals are entirely unaware they are suffering from a contemporary form of malnutrition, because they are consuming ample calories. The idea of starvation seems impossible, masking the insidious reality of cellular depletion. They are quite literally starving on a full stomach, their bodies desperately craving the unlocked minerals and pre-digested proteins that ancient fermentation once freely provided. This illusion of abundance hides a chilling biological deficit that continues to erode our collective health. It is a profound and unsettling mystery that a society capable of mapping the human genome and exploring the stars has completely forgotten how to safely feed itself. We possess the most abundant and technologically advanced food supply in the history of the world, yet our bodies are breaking down under its weight. We have severed the sacred, unseen thread that connected our ancestors to the earth, trading profound wisdom for the fleeting illusion of convenience. Looking back at the careful, deliberate hands of an ancient baker, we see a stark contrast to our modern arrogance. They understood without microscopes or laboratories that survival required patience, respect for the unseen world, and a deep partnership with nature. The true tragedy is not just that we lost this knowledge, but that we willfully discarded it, blinded by the hubris of industrial progress. Yet, as the consequences of this forgotten wisdom become impossible to ignore, modern science is finally being forced to look backward. Deep inside sterile modern laboratories, researchers are now slowly, and perhaps reluctantly, uncovering the exact mechanisms that ancient bakers knew purely by instinct. Through precise measurements and clinical trials, scientists are mapping the staggering increase in nutrient absorption that occurs when grains are subjected to traditional lactic acid fermentation. They are proving, with hard data, that the ancient slow method was never just a culinary preference but a highly sophisticated, essential technology for human survival. Modern laboratories are finally catching up to the quiet genius of our ancestors, using advanced spectrometers to measure the precise alchemy of traditional fermentation. When researchers analyze a loaf of true, slow fermented sourdough, they find that the rigid chemical locks holding back essential minerals have been completely shattered. Zinc, iron, and magnesium, once trapped within the grain, are suddenly flooded into a state of total bioavailability. The ancient bakers did not need microscopes to understand this transformation. They simply knew that dough left to sour in the cool night air created a bread that built stronger bodies and sharper minds. This rigorous scientific validation of ancient methods exposes a chilling reality about the food we consume today. Walk down any brightly lit aisle of a modern grocery store, and you are surrounded by an illusion of abundance that masks a profound nutritional theft. We have been sold a carefully packaged lie, convinced by decades of marketing that faster, whiter, and cheaper bread represents the pinnacle of human progress. The towering shelves are lined with plastic-wrapped loaves that look perfectly uniform, yet they are entirely devoid of the life-giving processes that sustained human civilization for thousands of years. Beneath the artificial preservatives and synthetic fortifiers lies a grim truth about an industry that prioritized profit over survival. The true life-saving secret to gut health was systematically stripped away, replaced by a dead product that fills our stomachs but starves our cells. It is a quiet, daily tragedy playing out in millions of homes, where families unknowingly consume the very foods that are destroying their internal ecosystems. Escaping this engineered nutritional void requires returning to a process that modern industry has desperately tried to erase. There is something deeply humbling about gazing into a simple jar of bubbling sourdough starter, a living artifact that defies complete industrial control. Even with the immense power of modern supercomputers and advanced microbiology, scientists still struggle to fully map the chaotic, beautiful web of life contained within that murky mixture of flour and water. It is a microscopic wilderness, a fierce and untamed ecosystem where billions of wild yeasts and bacteria engage in a complex dance of survival and cooperation. To cultivate a traditional starter is to invite a piece of the ancient, unyielding natural world back into the sterile confines of the modern kitchen. You cannot rush it, you cannot force it to conform to a factory schedule, and you must respect its living rhythm. This wildness is exactly what makes it so powerful, a stark reminder that true nourishment comes from collaborating with nature rather than trying to conquer it. This untamed microscopic alliance holds the key to reversing the damage inflicted by a century of highly processed, lifeless diets. When you consume true, slow-fermented grains, you are deploying a dedicated rescue team of ancient microbes directly into a compromised biological landscape. The journey begins the moment these pre-digested foods enter the digestive tract, where the lactic acid bacteria immediately set to work soothing inflamed tissues. They act as microscopic medics, patching the microscopic tears in the intestinal wall caused by years of exposure to unfermented, chemically locked compounds. As these beneficial bacteria establish their presence, they actively outcompete the harmful pathogens that thrive on modern ultra-processed sugars. They begin to rebuild the delicate mucosal lining of the gut, restoring the body's natural defense perimeter against disease and chronic inflammation. It is a slow, methodical restoration of internal order, reversing decades of biological neglect through the simple, ancient power of fermented food. As the internal defenses are slowly rebuilt, the devastating symptoms of modern malnutrition begin to quietly fade away. Imagine the profound, overwhelming relief of a body finally receiving the exact fuel it has been desperately craving for a lifetime. For those who transition back to ancient pre-digested grains, the transformation is often described as a sudden lifting of a heavy, invisible veil. The persistent brain fog that clouds daily life begins to evaporate, replaced by a sharp, sustained mental clarity that feels almost alien after years of chronic fatigue. Deep-seated aches and joint inflammation, long accepted as the unavoidable cost of aging, slowly begin to subside as the body stops fighting its own food. There is a quiet physical revelation in waking up without the familiar, painful bloating that follows a modern meal. It is the visceral sensation of a biological engine finally running on the pure, unlocked energy it was always designed to use. This physical awakening mirrors findings published in a 2021 clinical trial in Italy, where researchers documented significant reductions in gastrointestinal distress among patients who switched exclusively to traditionally fermented sourdough. The data confirmed what the relieved patients already felt, proving that the ancient method of predigestion fundamentally alters how the human body interacts with wheat. The secret weapon in this metabolic rescue operation is the humble yet incredibly powerful lactic acid bacteria produced during a long, slow fermentation. As these bacteria feast on the dough, they consume the rapidly digestible starches that normally cause violent blood sugar spikes in the human body. They transform the very structure of the carbohydrate, changing it from a volatile source of instant crashing energy into a steady, slow-burning fuel. This transformation effectively lowers the glycemic index of the grain, shielding the pancreas from the exhausting cycle of insulin surges and crashes. It is a biological safety net woven by microscopic organisms, ensuring that the energy derived from the bread sustains the body for hours without triggering a metabolic crisis. The ancient bakers unknowingly cultivated a natural medicine that kept their people resilient, focused, and physically stable. This invisible stabilization of our blood sugar reveals the stark, unsettling difference between food that sustains life and food that silently degrades it. When placed beneath the harsh, revealing light of a high-powered microscope, the true horror of our modern dietary shift becomes impossible to ignore. A slice of commercial factory-produced bread appears as a sterile, dead chemical sponge, completely devoid of any moving, living organisms. It is a ghost town of empty calories, a hollow structure engineered for shelf life rather than human vitality, standing in stark, chilling contrast to the vibrant, pulsing ecosystem found within a single crumb of ancient sourdough. Under the harsh light of a 400-power electron microscope, the modern slice of commercial supermarket bread reveals itself as a sterile, dead chemical sponge, completely devoid of life and heavily laced with industrial preservatives like calcium propionate. In stark, unsettling contrast, a single drop of ancient sourdough starter is a thriving, moving universe, teeming with billions of active yeast cells and beneficial bacteria like Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis, the very microscopic life forces that our bodies desperately need to survive and extract basic nutrition. Seeing that lifeless commercial sponge under the lens makes it abundantly clear why a new resistance is quietly forming across modern kitchens. As rates of severe gluten intolerance and chronic digestive inflammation skyrocket globally, thousands of disillusioned consumers are realizing that the industrial food system has fundamentally failed them, prompting a deliberate shift away from mass-produced grocery aisles. A covert movement of everyday people is now reclaiming this lost art, turning their own home kitchens into makeshift biological laboratories equipped with digital scales and temperature probes. They are deliberately working to resurrect the exact ancient microbes that modern baking conglomerates tried so hard to eradicate in the 1950s, seeking to rebuild the robust digestive biomes that our ancestors naturally possessed. By mixing simple unbleached rye and spring water in glass jars on their counters, they are actively capturing wild airborne yeast over a period of 7 to 10 days and taking their metabolic health back into their own hands. It is a quiet, steady rebellion against a massive $200 billion global food system that explicitly values indefinite shelf life over basic human vitality. Yet beneath the bubbling jars of this modern revival lies a profound and heavy sadness for the vast biological heritage that was carelessly lost. For nearly 6,000 years, there was an unbroken chain of mothers and fathers passing down living food cultures to their children, treating these resilient starters as a sacred heirloom of survival that could sustain a family through brutal European winters and perilous ocean crossings. That invisible thread connecting countless generations was violently severed in just a few short decades following World War II, drowned out by the roar of steel roller mills and the false promises of mass convenience. The introduction of the Chorleywood bread process in 1961 stripped away the living heart of the home, replacing a slow 3-day fermentation cycle with cold, lifeless machinery that spits out loaves in under 3 hours. The tragedy of that broken generational chain forces us to look much closer at the true biological cost of our modern dietary comfort. When we analyze the gut microbiomes of modern urban populations compared to isolated indigenous groups, the catastrophic loss of internal bacterial diversity becomes a damning indictment of the processed foods we blindly accept as normal. It raises a deeply unsettling question that haunts this entire investigation into our global food supply chain. If modern industrial society was so dangerously wrong about the very foundation of human nourishment, completely ignoring the necessity of bacterial pre-digestion, what other vital survival secrets, like traditional seed sprouting or wild vegetable fermentation, have we arrogantly discarded in the name of mechanized progress? We traded ancient, life-saving biochemical wisdom for manufacturing speed and quarterly corporate profit. leaving us to wonder how many other natural cures and environmental connections are currently rotting in the forgotten corners of agricultural history. We blindly assumed our synthetic vitamins and chemical dough conditioners made us smarter than the past, and that profound industrial arrogance has directly fueled an epidemic of autoimmune disorders and metabolic disease. Facing the grim reality of what we systematically threw away leaves only one viable path forward for those willing to see the truth behind the supermarket shelves. Escaping this nutritional dead end requires stepping completely outside the conventional commercial food paradigm and actively reintroducing the precise biological mechanisms that our bodies evolved to recognize over thousands of millennia. The practical return to these ancient ways is shockingly simple, yet it functions as a radical act of defiance against a deeply broken agricultural system. You do not need expensive laboratory equipment, commercial-grade ovens, or specialized nutritional degrees to bypass the mega-corporations and take back absolute control of your daily food supply right on your own kitchen counter. The simple act of mixing stone-ground flour and water to ferment, or soaking dried field corn in alkaline water made from hardwood ash, is enough to wake up the dormant biological mechanisms. These basic steps actively destroy the phytic acid that blocked mineral absorption, successfully unlocking the essential B vitamins, niacin, and bioavailable iron that kept our ancestors alive through brutal famines and unforgiving winters. The sight of that simple flour and water mixture expanding with trapped carbon dioxide, alongside the distinct, sharply acidic aroma wafting from a glass jar, is quite literally the sound and smell of an old world breathing again in a modern home. It represents millions of living organisms working in perfect symbiosis to pre-digest the heavy starches before they ever reach your stomach. By reclaiming these exact methods, you tap into a profound biological power and directly connect to a resilient lineage of Mesoamerican farmers and early European bakers who understood how to maximize their harvests. Understanding the organic alchemy of wild yeast fermentation and the precise chemistry of alkaline ash means you are no longer a helpless dependent victim of the modern industrial food machine and its endless commodity crop subsidies. You now hold the exact biological key to metabolic health that allowed early humans to expand and thrive in the harshest, most unforgiving environments on Earth, from the high-altitude Andes to the arid plains of the Fertile Crescent. You possess the forgotten knowledge required to turn hard, toxic, and otherwise indigestible grass seeds into safe, life-giving nourishment that builds robust immune systems. Holding that ancient key completely changes how you look at every single meal placed in front of you, shifting your perspective from merely counting empty calories to evaluating the living microbial ecosystem of your food. You begin to instinctively recognize the dangerous shortcuts taken by fast food corporations and demand the slow, deliberate preparation methods that actually sustain human tissue. The long-term consequence of this consumer awakening is a permanent structural shift in how communities source their food, sparking a massive rising global demand for unhybridized heritage grains like einkorn, emmer, and turkey red wheat, alongside a resurgence of local, stone-ground milling facilities. People are actively refusing to buy the sterile, preservative-laden sponges sold in plastic bags, forcing regional grocery markets and large-scale farmers to rapidly adapt to this undeniable economic pressure. This quiet, kitchen-based rebellion is slowly forcing modern nutritional science to completely rewrite its dietary guidelines and publicly admit that the slow, methodical old ways were right all along. The very agricultural institutions and university research hospitals that aggressively pushed for ultra-processed convenience are now spending millions of dollars mapping the gut microbiome, desperately studying the exact ancient microbes they once tried so hard to destroy. The true cost of abandoning ancient wisdom was paid in the quiet suffering of countless families. When factories stripped the life from our daily bread, generations were left chronically undernourished, their bodies failing from a silent, invisible starvation even as their plates were full. Mothers unknowingly fed their children empty calories, entirely disconnected from the vibrant, living foods that had sustained their ancestors for millennia. The sudden rise of modern digestive illnesses was not a random tragedy, but the direct human fallout of severing a sacred biological tie to the earth. This historical rupture eventually forced a reckoning within modern medicine. By the early 2000s, clinical dietitians and gastroenterologists began to trace a massive spike in gluten intolerance directly back to the rapid, chemical-heavy methods of commercial baking. The fundamental assumption that industrial food science had improved our lives was shattered. Researchers realized that, by skipping the long, slow breakdown of proteins that wild fermentation provided, we had essentially engineered a food supply our own bodies could no longer recognize or safely digest. Yet, as we dig through the remnants of forgotten foodways, a haunting question remains buried in the soil. Even as we attempt to revive these ancient practices, we must wonder if the original, untamed wildness of the ancient grains has been permanently lost to decades of aggressive agricultural breeding. We can mix water and flour today, hoping to catch the wild yeast drifting through the air of our modern kitchen. But we cannot fully know if the complex, microscopic ecosystems that thrived in the stone bakeries of antiquity can ever truly be resurrected in a world so heavily altered by chemicals. This realization has triggered a profound shift in agricultural science and food policy. Independent laboratories and heritage grain conservancies are now actively working to locate and protect uncorrupted seed banks, pulling ancient wheat varieties back from the brink of extinction. The result is a tangible change in how local food systems operate, with new alliances forming between farmers and artisan bakers to bypass the industrial supply chain entirely. They are building a parallel economy, rooted in the concrete understanding that true nourishment requires time, not just mass production. For the individuals caught in the crossfire of the modern diet, this return to tradition offers a profound, deeply personal relief. People who spent years battling chronic pain and inflammation are finding that their bodies can finally heal when they consume grains prepared with ancient respect. It is a quiet, powerful reclaiming of health at the kitchen table. Families are once again able to break bread together without fear, experiencing the profound comfort of a staple food that works with their biology rather than against it. The aftershocks of this awakening are actively dismantling the blind trust we once placed in the supermarket aisle. The realization that convenience was sold to us at the cost of our vitality has fundamentally changed how a new generation approaches survival. We now look at a shelf of perfectly uniform, heavily preserved loaves, not as a triumph of modern engineering, but as a warning sign. The illusion of cheap instant food has been broken, replaced by a stark understanding of the hidden biological debt it carries. But the path backward is fraught with a deeply unsettling modern challenge. The ancient methods of soaking, sprouting, and tending to a living starter demand a relentless daily devotion that clashes violently with the exhausted pace of contemporary life. The lingering doubt is whether we still possess the collective endurance to keep these living traditions alive. In a world designed to drain our time and attention, can we truly sustain the slow, quiet patience required to nurture a fragile ecosystem in a jar on our counters? Despite the friction of modern life, a durable cultural resistance has taken root. A global network of bakers and home cooks has begun treating sourdough cultures not just as ingredients, but as living historical archives to be fiercely protected and shared. This has resulted in community-led starter libraries, where dormant cultures from across the world are cataloged, preserved, and distributed to anyone willing to learn. It is a decentralized living institution, ensuring that the biological keys to human survival are never again locked away by industrial monopolies. The ultimate consequence of unearthing this lost wisdom is the restoration of human agency. Communities that were once entirely dependent on fragile, highly processed supply chains are slowly rebuilding their food sovereignty, one jar of bubbling flour and water at a time. When a person mixes wild yeast into dough, they are no longer just making a meal. They are actively repairing a broken ancestral link, stepping out of the shadows of an industrial experiment and taking their health and survival back into their own hands. Somewhere in the quiet dark of a sleeping modern house, a simple glass jar rests on a cold kitchen counter, its thick, pale mixture of milled flour and water slowly rising and falling with a silent, living breath. Beneath that ordinary surface, millions of microscopic organisms, specifically wild yeasts like Saccharomyces, Cerevisiae, and lactic acid bacteria, are executing the exact same chemical transformation that rescued early human civilizations from widespread malnutrition. Those tiny, unbroken carbon dioxide bubbles hold no malice, but rather contain the 14,000-year-old echo of the Natufian hunter-gatherers in the eastern Mediterranean. The first humans who learned to tame this invisible biological force by accidentally capturing airborne spores and allowing them to predigest toxic, nutrient-locked cereal grains. Our ancestors turned the constant looming threat of seasonal starvation into the very substance of long-term survival. Every time that starter culture breathes in the dark, it continues an unbroken chain of cellular respiration stretching back to the dawn of agriculture, leaving behind a profound, living secret still whispering from the shadows of our deepest past.